Alright guys, what's going on? Welcome back. Welcome to the third video in this installment of My Car is a Piece of Crap. If you haven't seen the other videos, go watch them. We'll put the link up here. Basically, where we were left off in the last video was I had just pulled the supercharger off and the manifold off to get to the cooler to see if it was leaking. This is the cooler here. This is a little brick that sits between the supercharger and the intake, and the air goes through these fins, and then as it goes through the fins, it cools the air before it goes into the engine. So as the tuner said, when it was there getting tuned, they thought that that was leaking coolant into the engine. They said that it was coolant in cylinder 4. So I pulled that all apart, got to it. I took that cooler, took it down to Rad Former Radiators in Bayswater. He's an absolute legend, absolute genius when it comes to radiators, and just builds them all from scratch and everything. I'll put his details here. Basically, he pressure tested it up to 50 PSI or something for ages, maybe like for the day or whatever, and it didn't leak at all. There was nothing wrong with it. All the fins are perfect. So that left me scratching my head a bit. I was a little bit confused. Even he said, first of all, that this system isn't pressurized at all. All it is circulating water through an electric pump. So it makes no sense for it to leak. Like, they literally have your two fittings that go in on the end. These two fittings go in on each end, and then the water just goes in this hole and then comes out that hole, and it's not pressurized at all. It just flows through with the electric pump. So basically, we know that that's not leaking now, so we cross that off the list. The intercooler isn't leaking. They said that they were topping it up, but there's no coolant going anywhere, so I have no idea how that was happening. So basically, next on the list of things that could have happened if there was coolant in the engine is the head gasket had been blown. So next up, I borrowed a pressure tester kit from my mate Heath at Rapid Tune Lodale. He's been helping me out do all the work on this as we've been going through this little scenario. But basically, the radiator circulates water around the engine, and then it keeps the engine cool while it's running. So if you've blown a head gasket, water can go into the engine through the gasket. So what I did was I did a pressure test on the radiator to see if any water was getting through. There was a bit of a leak on one of the fittings, so I fixed that. And then after that, I pressure tested it. We were losing about a PSI over like an hour, but there was no water anywhere and I couldn't find it. So what Heath told me to do is I pulled the headers off, and then I pressure tested the system again, left it for an hour to make sure that if there was any water, it would go into the thing. And then I started the car up to see if any water would blow out the exhaust, you know, now that the headers weren't on. So I did that, started the car up after the hour, got absolutely no water out of the exhaust. It was perfectly fine. A torch, looked up into the engine, didn't see any water, not an absolute drop. So basically, that's the two things that possibly could have gone wrong with a car, causing water to go into the engine, and they've both been crossed off the list. The head gasket is perfectly fine, and the supercharger cooler is perfectly fine. So I have absolutely no idea what these tuners were talking about. I can't imagine what was wrong with the car, what they were saying. And it's hard to say with what they were thinking because I wasn't there. Ideally, they should have just pressure tested both systems and then to see if there was a leak. Like, it would have taken them half an hour for both. And then we could have erased all of this hard work and just stuffing around mostly. It's really hard because you're just going off like third-hand information, like their mechanic's telling their office guy and then he's telling you. So I pulled it all apart. It's literally perfectly fine. So honestly, all I can do now is just put it back together, get it running again, and then send it away to get tuned. So I'll decide whether to go through a different tuner or go back to the same place. The issue with this car is it runs an EcuTech program on the ECU, which is like the car's ECU, but it's like an external program, and not very many places actually do that program. That's why I went with this company in the first place. So that's all just something we're gonna have to work out in the future. But for now, we've got everything laid out. So as I showed you there, this was just had heaps of oil in it, so I've got that soaking in degreaser. We're gonna clean that up. This has had all silicone around it. I've just been cleaning this up with the blade here. The exact same thing with the supercharger, just cleaning all that up. I've got all new fittings to go onto the back of the elbow, because there's 3 fittings there, the vacuum lines. So yeah, it's been an interesting ride. I've learnt a lot. I definitely would never have, you know, tried to do this kind of stuff beforehand, but you know, I'm glad I've done it. I'm glad I got the experience, but it is super annoying because basically none of this actually needed to happen. So it's all just been a massive waste of time, huge waste of money, not to mention. But yeah, you take the good with the bad. I've got to learn a lot through this situation, so I'll take that. But I mean, apart from that, mostly just annoying. But yeah, so I'm just going to get everything put back together, put all the gaskets back in, all the O-rings. One of the things I will say, so you can see here, this is where the air goes through. the manifold into the engine. The supercharger sits on top, sucks the air down into that. So you can see how free flowing this is. Now, how weird is it that this sits here and the air then has to go through that? So the air can only get through 1, 2, 3, 4, these 4 fins. So it just seems like a massive spin out to have the air flowing through that. Like, I've spoken to a few people. I spoke to the radiator guy and like a couple of my mechanic mates, and they've just said that's just crazy weird that, you know, you're having all this air, just it's compressed and it's being pushed into the engine, but then you're having it blocked by this little cooler here. Like how much air can you possibly even be getting through this brick? So like, yeah, you've gone from having all that nice flowing air in, and now it's got to try and force its way in through there. So I can only imagine how restricted it's being by going through there. I did get priced up to get a different kind of radiator made up, one that would flow a lot faster. It was about 850 bucks, and I thought, you know, for now we'll just stick with what we've got. You know, we know it works, and you know, it was obviously designed by the professionals the way that they designed the supercharger, so we'll stick with it. But I mean, if down the track we're chasing a little bit more power or anything, and I definitely think you could get more power out of it if you had a more free-flowing cooler. So that's definitely something to keep in mind, but for now, it's not a big issue. I really need to get this car put back together and get back on the dyno. I've got an event coming up in like 3 weeks, and dyno time's always hard to book in, so hopefully I can just get it put back together, get it back on the dyno, and just leave it all in the past and just get some good running in.